to Wordfirst Radio.
Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome to Wordfirst Radio, the podcast brought to you by Wordfirst Ministries. I'm your host, Jacob O'Neill, and as always, I'm joined by my friend Cameron.
Hello.
And today, we are joined once again by Dr. Julian.
Hi.
Woo! Thank you so much for being back on the show with us. We had such a fun time last time.
Definitely.
It's been a while. So today, I wanted to ask you about, some of my favorite things to talk about ever, but I hope other people can get excited about it. Today I wanted to ask you about the preservation of the Bible, because I think like a lot of people, when they read the Bible and they first start to think, like they maybe start to question privately, like, okay, well, where did this come from? Like how did I get this in my hands today? How do I know that? Because it was I don't know when it was written. I guess it was written thousands of years ago. How do I know that what's sitting in my hand is exactly what the guys wrote thousands of years ago when they wrote it down? And I think it's something that when people start to think about, they go online and they try and research it. And on research, online, there's a lot of terrible information on Instagram and TikTok. That's
but I will say this: there is some good information on these places as well. It's the trick is to be a bit discerning.
Sure, right.
Well, and I think there's an intuitive way of thinking about it, so there are some fields where you like, just by imagining how I think this must happen, I sort of grant myself some expertise that maybe doesn't match the reality of how the thing actually works. And so this is one that I see, if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me, this is something I see going around. It's been going around for a long time. I see it all over the place on social media, and I think this probably, it's comical, of course, but I think it captures maybe the basic idea or the way that a lot of people think that we got the Bible, something like this. It's a quotation from a comedian called David Cross. You probably know who he is. He says this: the Bible was written and then rewritten and then edited and then re-edited and then translated from dead languages, then re-translated, then re-edited, then re-edited and then retranslated, then given to kings for them to take their favorite parts out, then re-edited, then retranslated and then re-edited, then given to the Pope for him to approve, then retranslated, then rewritten, then rewritten, then re-edited, retranslated, re-edited again, all based on stories that were told orally 30 to 90 years after they happened to people who didn't know how to write. So I guess what I'm saying is the Bible is literally the world's oldest game of telephone.
You have to laugh, because if you don't, you'll cry.
Well, how closely does that characterize your life's work?
Completely accurate. It's fascinating when we talk about the transmission of the Bible. I think it's useful to separate the Old and the New Testament because their transmission history is quite different. And to start with the earliest source, I think to the Hebrew Bible it was written and it's important first to remember that the Bible is a library. Right? It's a collection of books, and these books were written at different times by different people, and at some point they were collected. And they were collected, and the collection, the text that we currently have, was finished sometimes during the 2nd century before Christ, something like that. And at that time, we also the Bible was also translated into Greek, right?
That's the Old Testament.
The
Old Testament was translated into Greek.
The Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. And when we find quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament, they are almost exclusively of that Greek translation.
So the people writing the New Testament in Greek, quoting the Old Testament, are quoting the Greek translation of the Hebrew texts.
Correct.
Okay.
Very good. Yeah, that's a great summary. So what we want then, right, is we want to get the physical sheet, the physical paper that the first scribe wrote down. That would be the ideal, right? That we want, but we don't have those physical copies, right? And for the Hebrew Bible, it's a bit complicated because the complete copy of the Hebrew manuscript we have is from the 11th century after Christ.
Okay.
Right.
So it's like 1300 years.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's a long time. But we do have physical copies of manuscripts of the Greek translation that from around 200 or so after Christ. Okay. But that's a translation. So that means we have a bit of a conflict. It's like, how do we get to the oldest possible text?
Right.
Okay.
All right. here, the oldest physical manuscripts we have are a translation, and the original manuscripts we have are thousands of years, almost 1,000 years older.
Okay.
So that's an issue. It was an issue until like the 1940s when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's in Israel on the west side of the Dead Sea. We found, I think it's 19 different caves with a lot of these scrolls on it.
Yeah, yeah.
And when we compare the Hebrew text and the Greek text that we had, we found discrepancies in certain places. The question is, which one of these are oldest? Then?
Yeah, okay.
And what we found is that in several places where the Greek text differs from the Hebrew text, the Greek text actually ended up matching some of the Hebrew texts we found at the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay. And how old are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
So they were found in the 1940s, but they are probably dated to like the 200s before Christ.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was a
that overcomes
massive-
that 1,000-year age
Exactly.
gap.
It closes that age gap. So they're older than the earliest manuscripts we have of the translation. This is before the translation into Greek was made, or
Okay.
around that time probably. So that's insane, to be honest, in terms of like our textual sources.
Yeah.
So the question for anyone should be, what do we want to get to? Well, we want to get to the oldest possible or most original text. Right. And what we have to do then is that we have this 11th century Hebrew text. We have this 200 before Christ Hebrew text. We have this 200 after Christ Greek text. And we have the Latin Vulgate from like 400 after Christ. So we have... And we have to work with all of them. See what are the differences, what are the similarities, what is likely to be, something that's changed later, what is likely to be earlier, and that's a problem. It just is a problem.
Yeah.
It's just how it is with ancient texts. The Bible is an ancient text, and this is the issue we have. And for a concrete example, it's the height of Goliath, which is a very interesting example.
Yeah, this is, I think, the first time you and I met, we talked about this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I recently actually wrote in a newspaper about it as well. But in the Masoretic text, which is what we call this 11th century Hebrew text, he is, I don't know how it's phrased in English. He's 3 meters and 25 centimeters. He's about 6 yards, I think.
Sure.
He's measured in yards, I guess.
And
in
a meter and a yard are roughly equivalent.
Well, are they? Okay,
Yeah,
Is he
roughly.
measured in cubits or?
we call it an alen in Norwegian. A cubit, perhaps.
Yeah.
Let's say, but regardless, he has a height. It's equivalent to 3 meters or thereabout.
Yeah. That's like 10 feet.
Yeah.
For our
10 feet, good.
For our for people who are still using proper rules and measures.
Yeah,
Right,
very
right.
good. Thanks.
Proper.
The
King James.
I'm happy with that. So you translate it into measurement.
I'll
for
do
me
my
because
best.
I can.
Okay, yeah. So
But that's the Masoretic text. Then in some of the Greek manuscripts we have, not all of them, but some of them, some of the oldest, he's a meter lower.
Okay.
So that would be
6 or 7 feet.
Yeah, 6 or 7 feet. So that's the difference. And we're like, okay, which is the oldest height? Well, we don't really know. And since the Greek is a translation, we're not going to go for that measurement.
Right.
Because the translation is, by its nature, changed a little bit. Yeah. But then we found among the Dead Sea Scrolls this exact text from the book of Kings. And it had the same measurement as the Greek translation did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So what we said then, okay, then that is likely to be the oldest.
Right.
And then we can apply some logic to it, which is, what is more likely? That he was said to be 6 feet.
Oh, 7 is probably better.
Yeah.
6 feet wouldn't be that remarkable, but 7 I think gets you into
It's like
giant territory.
He would be like a tall NBA player.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And then grew later, or that he was, a literal giant and then shrank.
Right, as people tell the story.
So my point is this:
the bad guy doesn't get shorter.
What is the likely? I mean, if you catch a fish,
Right.
what is the likelihood it's
exactly what I was going to say. Yeah.
As you tell the story,
Right.
So that's the kind of logic we have to apply to the biblical text, and the way I see it, the only way we can do this work is to try to get as close to the original, the oldest text as possible.
Sure.
And then we start applying this to the New Testament, and here it becomes even more complicated. Because we have a lot of manuscripts from the New Testament. We have huge amounts of manuscripts in Greek. And if you add the translations, as you mentioned before we started this podcast, even more so.
Right.
Right. And we have to start thinking, what is the oldest text? And this is exactly what happened. Before the translation to King James Version, there was an attempt to collect all the Greek manuscripts, right? And this was done by Erasmus of Rotterdam, right? He sat down and he said, okay, we need to collect all the Greek manuscripts so that we have a source material for our translation.
Sure.
The issue is he lived in Rotterdam and he didn't have access to all the manuscripts. He had access to all the manuscripts in Rotterdam.
Yeah.
So by nature, it wasn't, that kind of restriction on selection is arbitrary, right?
Yeah.
Because he was located in, of course, he could be divinely inspired, I'm sure. But the point is that, and even worse, is that he didn't have a complete Greek manuscript of Revelation at all.
Yeah.
Right.
And what he did was he translated from the Latin back into the Greek for his Greek source text. Right.
Yeah.
And
what an incredible genius to be able to do that. But you can see if what we want is we want to know what the original pen and ink and paper said. You can see how that maybe is not
absolutely, but there's
an ideal strategy.
All credit. This hadn't been done before, and he was under a lot of time constraint, and he was completely honest about this issue. It's nothing of this is like kept secret or it wasn't known about. There's nothing nefarious about this, and it's such a good attempt, right? And but the thing is, like, we now have access to a lot more manuscripts. We have access to better manuscripts, and we can see this, that the scribes, they would, for example, we can find this. You find one manuscript, then you find a verse added in the margins of that page, and then you find a later manuscript and it put into the text, right? And that's all in all, it's actually marvelous how little is added and changed, and is different between how many verses are found in modern NRSV translation and in the King James Version. It's incredible, honestly. But I think we have to have the ideal that we want to go for the most authentic possible. And the only way to do that is by the work that's done. And they have several interesting principles as what is the more original text. And sometimes they can be challenging. One example is in Luke, in chapter 2, that it says, it used to say that Joseph and Mary looked at their son with pride. I don't know the exact wording in English, but then in most modern translation, it says his father and his mother. And that's, of course, the issue is Joseph Jesus' father, right? So, and then we have to apply the logic is, did they originally write Joseph and his mother and then change it at some point to his father and his mother? That seems unlikely, especially with the developing doctrine of like virgin birth, right?
Exactly.
Or did they originally write his father and his mother, and someone said, well, that doesn't really fit really well with with virgin birth, right? But of course, I don't find it to be a problem, right? Because still, he was, in a sense, he taught Jesus how to be a carpenter. He was certainly an adoptive father.
You're right.
So it doesn't falsify the text. But that is the issue, like, which one of these two are the oldest? But that is also typically the level at what we're discussing, right? And if we can go in such fine-grained level at such verses, it shows that what we have been passed through is still, so much the same.
We'll hit pause so you could fix the lights, and then I have a question I'm going to ask you.
You're going to ask me?
No, I'm going to ask Julian. I know that you could...
No, it's fine.
I know I could ask you this question, but I'm going to ask him because we brought him on. I can ask me this question, but I'm going to ask him it. Okay. Thank you so much for laying that out. And kind of just on that vein, with the, there are these, what people call like textual variants in these manuscripts. We have all these, this is a common charge that's pitted against the New Testament, is that there are more variants in the New Testament. I think there's around like 400,000, something like that. There are more variants in the New Testament than there are words in the New Testament. And just to quickly explain what a variant is, it's just a difference between one manuscript to another. There are these like differences that some read, like you were just explaining. Some manuscripts read Joseph and Mary or his father and mother. Is that a problem? Because that makes people uncomfortable. They read like skeptics online and say like, oh my gosh, there's more change. They either interpret them as changes or uncertainties or things like that. There's more variance in the
Testament than words. It sounds like you got a box of words and you shook it up and you dumped it on the table and said that could be as likely as what you've actually got.
So how much of a problem is that, given that that's just a reality of the manuscripts we have? How much of a problem is that?
Yeah, I mean... The large majority of these textual variants are things like, does it say Jesus Christ or does it say Christ Jesus? Or obvious transcription errors, like where you have on one line, you had a word and you had the same word on a different line, and the scribe was working and he took a coffee break, which I'm sure was common.
Must have been a Norwegian scribe.
He came back and he was looking at the text and he started at the wrong point, so he missed a line. Like, most of the variants are these types of things.
Right.
Yeah. And then other things are interesting. So take the woman who was caught in adultery. Right?
Yes.
Which is a story that aren't in the oldest manuscripts.
Yeah, you're breaking my heart. I love that story.
But the story is certainly must have been in circulation among the Christians. It could have been an oral tradition, right? And it's you find it in different manuscripts added in different places.
Right.
So okay, maybe it wasn't in the original manuscripts. There might have been a good tradition to have it, and it's a wonderful story, right? It tells a lot of truth, I think, regardless of its... So there is always like... so that is one of these texts where we made a judgment call in the Norwegian Bible Society. It should probably have been put in the footnotes, but it was put in the original text because of tradition and because of... So we do... There are some of these stories, but even these major parts, right, is... what is removed and what is added is so minor that it is amazing. And the same is true when we did find the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
And we had this Masoretic text with 1,000-year difference.
Right.
It is so similar, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So to me, that is more of an evidence that, we have a good textual foundation here. And we should be really proud of that. And the variance is the normal human variance that we have in everything that we should actually be proud of. Because it is... God has always chosen humans. And that's how humans work.
I remember reading about one particular two kinds of variants. One is, what are they called? Movable mu? Or is it movable nu? Mu?
Yeah.
Mu? I don't know how you even say the Greek. Anyways, but it's like the difference between in English a or an. And there wasn't a strict rule. And every time somebody writes a rather than an or an rather than a, that counts as variants. And so that's a whole bunch of them.
Right.
And you go, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense. But then I remember reading about a kind of variant where somebody for a purpose was they were producing a new text and they were quoting something from the New Testament, but it was a quotation, and so maybe the New Testament said something like, "And he said to them," but the person writing the thing, maybe it's a prayer book or a devotional, whatever, says, "And Jesus said to the 12," in order to make that more explicit. And so you in one sense, you'd say, well, that's a variant. But it's not like putting a bunch of words in a box and shaking it up and dumping them out. It's So learning a little bit about variants and then how they help us, like I have anything to do with it, help the actual intelligent scholars to be more confident about what the original said is, I think that's really, it changes your mind and perspective about things. And also, I'll ask you this, Julian. So this is something that we're just talking about that only the Christians do when translating the Bible, right? When it comes to producing modern translations of ancient texts. Or is it something we do when we translate Homer or Tacitus?
No, this is how we translate ancient texts. But I think. Again, we have so many manuscripts, right? And these manuscripts are difficult to read because, like, ancient Greek didn't use spacing between words, right? It's a whole mess, to be honest. But the people who work on this, it's such a complicated field, and are amazing. And in general, lay people and even biblical scholars aren't able to, work at the level that they are. So we have this textual critical edition of the New Testament. It's called Nestle Aland.
Yep.
28th edition. It was published in 2012, right? So they continuously work. And the amount and type of work that goes into it is by the best scholars and academics in the world. What's fascinating is you find that critics of these editions often attack the ideology of the people working on it rather than the work they do, because the work they do is amazing and so complicated. But if you find that they have an ideology that they aren't, inerrant enough in their approach to the Bible, then you can just disprove it.
Right. Sure.
And I find that to be, but I have this issue, right? People like you, Bart Ehrman, right? Who's a scholar that is sometimes feared and hated in certain Christian environments. I find him amazing. He's such a talented scholar, and he's such a deep, he's such an honest scholar as well. And it's like we can't listen to him because he doesn't believe the same things we do. I find that to be an abhorrent attitude, to be honest, because that's not how we deal with anything, right? We don't. I don't ask you what you believe and then decide whether I should listen to you or not. Right? I base it on what you're actually saying. And I think that's the attitude we need to have to the scholars, to the people who work on this. Because what they're trying to do, what everyone working on this is trying to do, regardless of their opinions, is get to the best text possible.
Yeah. I think that's something that, because I've actually said on the podcast before, I actually really admire Bart Ehrman as a Christian. I know he's not a Christian. Sure. It's like, listen, I've read his stuff, right? And I've seen his debates. Like, I know where Bart Ehrman stands on like all these things. But like exactly what you were just explaining, what I was explaining, or actually what I said about the variants, like how many there are, that there are more than the words in the New Testament. I learned that from Bart Ehrman.
Absolutely.
And what you said when you said, well, the vast majority of them, like we can identify that we can see that they're mistakes. We can, and we can correct them. Bart Ehrman says the same thing. He says the same thing in his book. He's like, the vast majority of them. I think actually, Cam, your buddy Kurt Jarris had as a series called Misquoting Ehrman, where people are misrepresenting his work. And when he said that, I was like, dang, I wish we had talked about it so I could claim he stole my idea. Because I have been saying that for years, that people have been misrepresenting Bart Ehrman. Now, I think he's wrong about several things, but he's not wrong about everything.
No.
And I think,
and that is because he's a scholar, right? He doesn't have to. I think it's easy to be afraid of people with different opinion or complicated truths. And I think people often are afraid of that because if it is easy, if it is so that we have one edition and translation of the Bible that's the authority, that's absolutely correct, then everything is easy and it falls black and white out of that. The truth is always complicated.
Sure. Yeah.
And it seems to me that is how God wanted to transmit His word. And that should provide us with a measure of humility in approaching the text and approaching each other, because that seems how, to me, that seems how He wanted. Now I'm bored. I'm going into the field of theology, which certainly isn't my field. But I think that's a perspective that we can bring with us from the fact that this is what the Bible is,
right? And that we at least shouldn't be surprised that when it comes to, so as Christians, we take the Bible to be the Word of God and to be inspired, which is a specific thing, but that we shouldn't be surprised that the handling and transmission of something that with that much gravity might require humility and wisdom and faithfulness.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So on that note, how does this compare? Because when we're out evangelizing, and when I talk to like Muslims, for example, online and things like that, and on the streets, they often bring this charge, against us. They talk about the variants, they talk about the changes, they talk about verses being taken out, things like that. And the alternative that they provide for me is that, well, listen, our Quran actually is perfectly preserved. We have one master mother manuscript that we can translate our Qurans from. We know exactly what it said because we have one line of transmission down to us today.
You guys talk about the Word of God, and you've got all these variants. We have one text.
Yeah, with no variance. That's often how it's posited to me.
Yeah.
Is that I want to get all your thoughts on that, but just, is that a superior position to be in? Are they at an advantage because of that?
Yeah, that is the question.
Yeah.
This is the only way. What is the starting point, right? If the starting point is what do we have, then what we arrive at is this is what the Bible is. But if the starting point is a dogma that says this is what the Bible has to be, it has to be the inerrant with everything that entails, inherent with everything that entails, word of God,
plenary inspired,
in its exactly in its verbal absolute form.
Right. Which comes first, the Chicago Statement.
Yeah, exactly. if that is, then this is an issue. Right?
Yeah.
I don't think there's any way about it. If that is how it is, then we have a inferior position probably to the Quran. Of course, there are textual variants in the Quran as well, and they did have a process of removing textual variants during the Ottomanic rule. So that's also a position. That's just how it is with ancient text.
Right.
We probably lost a lot of the biblical Hebrew manuscripts during the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD as well, which is one of the reasons we have so few textual variants of the Hebrew Bible preserved. So this is also just how the transmission of ancient text works. I think it weakens the position of absolute inerrancy in the seminary interpretation of what that means.
Sure.
Well,
I have an analogy I want to posit to you. I've used it a few. We'll see how this goes. If I'll get in trouble for using it, but I've never actually engaged a scholar like yourself on it. But based on my studies of the issue, I came up with this analogy of imagine. Like on a website, when you create a new account somewhere, like on Facebook, they make you enter your password twice. Okay, and I ask people, why do they do that? Well, because if you make a mistake the first or second time, you're probably not going to make it again the second time, or if you do, you're probably not going to make the same mistake in the same place. So make sure you get it exactly right. Now, then I ask people, imagine if you had to write down your password 5,000 times and get rid of the original, and you give it to me. Are you going to make mistakes?
Yeah.
Sure, but do you think I could figure out what your password said?
Yeah.
They say, yeah, probably. And then I say, if I'm talking to a Muslim, I say, now let's get with the Quran, okay? If you write down your password once, and if you make a mistake, that's your password. It's wrong. It's not what it was supposed to be. What do you think of that analogy? Do you think?
I'm not sure. I don't know all that much about Quranic transmission, so I don't know if that's fair to the Quranic transmission, but that is certainly a nice comparison to what we do with the textual variants in New Testament scholarship. It has to be that way. That we have a lot of sources, and we have to try and figure out what the best source is, and I think we're able to do that to a large extent. Then we probably all have our dogma that says that. Hopefully God also provides us with what we need
of course.
in that process. I like the analogy.
Yes. Awesome. Cool. Well, I get to use half of it. Perfect. I love it. Cool. I want to ask you now about another charge, maybe from critics or skeptics, or maybe even people who find this in their own Bibles and it makes them uneasy. So people like Barderman, he says this in his book, Misquoting Jesus, that there are places in the New Testament where we do not know what the original said. There are still gaps in the translation. We don't know what the original said. I don't know. He gives maybe some examples from the first verse of Galatians, I think, when it talks whether Paul's writing to the church or the churches or something like that. I actually don't know if that's the exact one, so my apologies. I just know that it comes from the early verses of Galatians was the example he used. And then some other people will say, they pick up in English, I don't know how it is in the Norwegian translations, but let's say they pick up their English New International Version for the first time. And so they get it, and they say, my favorite verse is 1 John 5:7. My favorite verse is 1 John 5:7. So they open their New International Version to see, oh, how does my favorite verse read? Well, they find out that it doesn't read. It doesn't read. The verse isn't there. And they're like, okay, well, I'll go to my second favorite verse, which is John 5:4. Maybe that's their second. Maybe that's the second favorite verse.
Of favorite verses.
Exactly. Maybe it is. And they go to John 5:4 and they realize, oh my gosh, where's John 5:4? It's not in this, it's in a footnote. Why isn't it in the text? So what do we do with that? How do we explain those things?
I mean, it is conflating two issues, right? Which is, one is that do we always know what the original manuscript would have said? No, we don't. We can't always know. I think that's probably true. I think what we can get to is the best reconstruction available, and we continually work towards that. But maybe we're wrong. In some places, maybe the original manuscript did say Joseph and his mother, rather than his father and his mother. We can always be wrong, but we need to work on some principled methods to get to the best text possible. So I think that's true. The removing of verses, right? That is because we want to get to the best and original and most likely to be authentic manuscripts. We can, then we sometimes have to remove verses or text. I mean, I think the major example of that is the ending of Mark, right?
Right.
Yeah, because Mark's end on a cliffhanger. And to avoid that, it was added sometime later, this very rushed and hurried kind of getting to the point. It's like Jesus rose again, and then the disciples were bitten by snakes and they lived and everything was fine. Like, it's just like it goes through. I don't. It's we say, okay, but that it was added later. We understand exactly why it was added later. But it did end on a cliffhanger. It uses the word God in Greek, which is for, and is never used to start a sentence in all of the New Testament, except for that final sentence
in Mark.
Which kind of indicates that maybe we lost the sheet. It was lost in history. We don't know, or maybe doesn't seem to be a rhetorical device used in ancient literature to cliffhanger. Sure. But because it ends with like, and they were afraid, I think is the last. So it's like, okay, I understand why we wanted to add an explanation of what was going on. But of course, Mark talks about the death and resurrection of Jesus. He knew that it happened. Everyone around him knew it. And the fact that he didn't include it isn't, isn't an issue. You should read the text. But, we understand why things were added later. And then, we can put that in a footnote, or we can put it, in a separate, to show that it was added later, because we want to be honest about the text. And I think that's...
Well, I'm going to ask the same question with maybe in a little bit more concrete way. So imagine a friend of mine actually posted this on Facebook the other day, and I'll get the nuts and bolts of the post, but maybe not exactly verbatim. But the idea was this. It was, hey, listen, we've got these modern translations of the Bible, like the New International Version and the ESV, the exceedingly superior version. And they have taken out all of these texts. It's missing this many words. It's missing this many doctrines. It's missing this many verses. And it's published by some nefarious people who publish some other rotten stuff. And all of that is bad enough. But what's worse is, like, if you insist on using one of these inferior translations of the Bible like the NIV or the ESV, at least have a paper version of the Bible, because if you're reading it digitally, then these things are getting, if you have the Bible app, these things are getting updated in the background, and you never know what's being changed or how they're changing your Bible. So I think that's several charges all at once. But if somebody said, if one of your Christian friends said, you do something at the Bible Society, what should I do about this? How would you address that?
Absolutely. And I think that is partly our fault, which is that we're not good.
Wait, who's our? I'm not including me.
Our Bible us Bible translators.
Okay, your side of the table.
My side of the table. Well, because we haven't been good at communicating. We haven't always been good at communicating what we do. But I think, let's take the Norwegian example, because that's where we live, is that we have been exceedingly honest about what has been going on, to such an extent that for the 3 years we have done the revision, we have had 2.5 years of people debating, discussing whether the proposed solutions are good. Because we're completely out, and the same is true. You can literally watch discussion of the ESV translation committee online.
Yeah.
Right. There's nothing happening behind the scenes, because they are scholars, because they are very concerned with openness, and if you make an effort, you can find out a lot about what they think. They advertise their updates and additions because they want people to buy them. They want people to read them, right?
They're incentivized to be open about it.
They're so incentivized. They're not going to make it. They're not going to put out the digital update without you being able to find out that they did that.
They don't burn the previous versions, right?
Absolutely, they don't. So it's you almost need to add a layer of conspiracy in order for that charge to work out. When we do get it, right? I have received several emails of that, saying like, the Bible Society is trying to make the Bible more liberal, or it's trying to do X, Y, and Z. And so what part of why I said yes to this podcast, but part of what I do, and I have tried to be very public, is because I want people to know there is a face behind that work, and it is everyone I have met and worked with, regardless of their position, theological ideologies, are very concerned with being as faithful to the Bible as possible when you translate it, because even when you think the Bible is wrong, that's because you think the Bible says something that you disagree with, right. So if you think if someone people if you think, for example, that the Bible is wrong, or Paul, let's specific, is wrong to condemn same-sex intercourse, then you still think that's what he says, and you want to translate that, right? So it's I think we what I have encountered is a deep respect for the texts and a longing to get to the most authentic version of it in the translated form. And I think that is true for nearly all translations. There might be some that there might be translations. I can't, exclude that possibility where someone has tried to change the text on purpose to say something different than it does. But by and large, I think that's the goal of everyone.
So I think I hear, I'm going to, tell me if what I'm about to, how I interpret you is, I think I'm hearing a couple of things. One is, listen, what the translators are doing is we want to present in a new language what the author wrote in an original language, and we want to get to what he wrote down, he or she or whatever. Just that whatever was written down, we want people in a new language to be able to understand. And contra the worries that I proposed to you about text being removed and under the hood updates that happen that are never seen. Well, there are a couple of things to say. One is, sometimes we remove text, but that's not. We remove text in the same sense that earlier translations added them. What we're getting at is not maybe a tighter or more ideologically pure version of the text. We just want what the author wrote. And there's stuff that through the course of history there are things that have been added, and so then we've taken out those things that have accreted to modern translations. And secondly, we can still go and check all of their work. So it's, unlike that quote that I read at the beginning of the podcast where things are edited and re-edited and it's this long game of telephone. It's like, well, no, we still have the generations of the earlier texts, and you can, irrespective of the ideological persuasion of the person doing the translating, you can go and check that person's work against the original text. So given sufficient time and study, you can find out whether what they've done is adulterate the meaning of the text or whether they preserved it.
Yeah, and the challenge that I want to put to everyone is that if you think something is obviously, if you disagree with a translation, say you use a concordance and you see then try to understand why they made those choices.
Sure.
Because if you're just a tiny bit open to them knowing what they're talking about, then suddenly you will discover new perspectives, right?
Yeah.
Every time I disagree with a translation choice, because I mean, I know the original languages, so I'll definitely disagree with a lot of translation choices all the time. That is the curse of knowing the original language as well. But then digging deep, you find, okay, but this is what they were thinking. Right. Yeah, I still might not think it's not the best way of phrasing it, maybe, but yeah, I can understand why they made those choices. So I think that is my challenge to people: is be open about the possibility that they know what they're doing.
And I think have confidence that these are people who know their work can be. In fact, their work is being checked now by other scholars. But it's happening in the public realm of scholarly discourse, not in a private secret chamber somewhere where they burn all of their notes and now what they give us, that's the new Bible, and have they broken it?
I'm just going to do one example of this because this was really fascinating. When we did our translation in 2011, we kept meticulous records of everything going on, all the decisions, all the processes, all of that. One scholar was critical to some of our choices regarding the Christology. I mean, whether Jesus is God, those things that concern that topic. And he thought we made some bad choices. That's the essence of it. And he said, can I have access to your records? And we said, yeah. He wrote his PhD on the translation choices and the process to arrive at those choices in the 2011 edition.
Wow.
Really thorough. He knows this stuff so well. It's a really good PhD, and he lands that, he thought there were some parts of the process that weren't as good as they should have been, and that the conclusions we came to might have been driven more by ideological choices than linguistic choices. And we took that as one of the feedbacks into the revision process. And some of those texts, which you mentioned, not all of them, but some of them were changed because of that. And it is like such a level of like intellectual honesty, right? Is that he gained access to everything. He worked through everything. He wrote his dissertation about it, and it came into our sources as part of why we want to make revisions. Right? This is how the work is being done. In complete honesty and openness, that even when we had some weaknesses in our process, someone can discover that because we gave them access to everything. Even the parts that made us look a little bad.
And so I like the way that you put it. Like there would have to be a layer of conspiracy in order to the idea that the Bible's being that there's if somebody had as a goal that they wanted to degrade the Bible, like you would have to have conspirators. And it would be a lot of work to get that done and to get that past translation committees and then the board that approves it and on and on. And then you at the end saying yes or no or putting beads in a box or
absolutely.
Very good. I love that example. I want to close with something else that's important. I remember when I first started looking into all this stuff, and it actually really made me excited. It's because I was raised in a household that taught inerrancy and infallibility. And I mean, I still am basically an inerrantist to a certain degree. But when I started discovering this stuff, it didn't really make me very uncomfortable or sad. It kind of made me like excited. I was like, oh, wow, I'm learning something I've never learned before. And it's really cool. And I started sharing it with my mom. And I was just like, oh my gosh, Mom, maybe the woman caught adultery story, maybe it wasn't in the original manuscript. Like what was, and as I explain all this to her, maybe not all of this, but most of this to her, she says, Jacob, I understand you're really excited about this, but this makes me very uncomfortable. And I was like, oh, well, why? Like, doesn't this kind of like undermine our trustworthiness in the Word of God? I mean, all these different variants. Oh my gosh, all these verses being taken out, which we did just kind of explain. But what the word I want to get to is uncertainty.
Yeah.
This seems to give people uncertainty,
Yeah.
and even you just said
Yeah.
a few minutes ago that maybe there are places where we can't be completely sure
Yeah.
what the original said.
Yeah.
Is that uncertainty that this could give some people? Is that a problem? Is that how do we address that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. For me, the uncertainty is part of the beauty. And I think it forces us to have a level of humility when engaging the biblical text, but also when engaging each other, because there is always a level of uncertainty. And I think that is super healthy, because if absolute certainty is a surefire way to close off your mind, and I think that is very unhealthy, and I think that has affected a lot of churches in really bad ways.
Right.
Yeah. That being said, I agree with what you say, because if you define inerrancy in such a way that you can't have textual variants, then this is a problem. But there are ways of thinking about inerrancy or infallibility which affords there to be differences, which affords some uncertainty. And I think some uncertainty is deeply healthy. But it is we have been taught to think of the Bible in such a way that there shouldn't and couldn't be any uncertainty, and I think that's unhealthy. And I think Bart Ehrman actually points to this when he says, I haven't checked this claim, but the claim is that especially people who come from such a background are more likely to lose their faith when they encounter this data than people who don't come from such backgrounds. And I think that's one of the reasons it's important for us to show that you can be a Christian, you can be a believer, you can have faith in the Bible. I do, despite knowing that there are variants and there are differences. To me, that is more showing the way God has communicated through people always.
So my sort of pastoral note, I know you didn't ask me, Jacob, but my sort of pastoral note to all of that is, I think this is just another example of how the Christian faith is so different from when we think of religion as a category. And it's like all of our revelation is a public matter. And that, like I said earlier, we have to handle it with humility and faithfulness. And it engages all of those attributes where that God has given to humanity that make us like Him. And so we have to be intelligent and careful and thoughtful. And we don't have an automatic writer who is our guru, who is receiving, a certain kind of a download from on high, and who knows what my hand was writing. And now this, as though God had written it with His own hand. And then I guess there's one sense in which you can that would grant you a higher level of certainty. Like we watched that, whatever, but then would give outsiders no access. And that's not a public event. That's somebody who's skeptical of your claims. Go, wait a minute. You're like, no, I got it from God. He made my hand write these words. And someone else can't check that. That's inside the black box of your own heart and mind.
And I even argue that this is how the Bible functions. So let me give you one example. There are laws in the Old Testament, and we think of them often as, if anything is directly from God, it has to be the laws of the Old Testament. So there are laws regarding who can inherit the land, right? And then comes the situation where there are 5 sisters, and they don't have any male siblings. And if they marry, then, the land that their father had is going to get lost. It's going to be, because they can't inherit that land. They don't have any brothers who could inherit it. So it's going to get lost. And they're like, that doesn't seem reasonable. And they go to Moses, and he basically goes, but that doesn't seem reasonable. He goes to God. And God says, yes, we make a provision for this. They can inherit the land. It's not supposed to leave. So that, to me, shows that this is how the Bible functions, right? Is that it has to be negotiated in that sense.
Or that it's a relational it's a relational implement. It's not
And if that is how the laws of the Old Testament functions, then surely that has to be how the Bible functions.
I like that.
I love the exact thing you said, which is, the uncertainty is like, it was where I find beauty, like in this, is one of the most beautiful things about that. I think that's true of me. I mean, I remember reading, like, misquoting Jesus, like people, saying like, oh, misquoting Jesus, like it's filled with a bunch of false information. It's not. And
you have to read the appendices.
You have to read the appendices. But I remember reading it myself and being like, actually, I'm not really like shaken at all. I don't think I don't think I'm really that shaken in this. I actually think that these things strengthen my faith in this, and like I think something that like I'm going to just speak about myself because I really wanted to, like as a teenager, hold to this kind of like rigid, like cookie cutter, exact, like it's been like every single word is like perfect. There are no discrepancies or contradictions. It's exactly word for word. And for me, I'm not trying to throw this on anyone who struggles with uncertainty at all. But for me, I thought I was more or less doing that out of like piety. And really what it was in me was actually from a source of pride. Not being, like you said, humble. And being humble enough to recognize, okay, how about we submit ourselves to the Word of God and try and take a step back and see, how did God actually want to give us His Word? I believe the Bible, with its, even with all the messiness that we just talked about, I believe the Bible is inspired. I believe it's infallible. I do believe in the doctrine of inerrancy. And I think that when we understand all the things that we talked about in this episode, those things, like your faith in it, your strength in it, the beauty of how God decided to preserve His Word and deliver it to us is so fascinating and so compelling. So those are my thoughts to close it out. Thank you so much, Dr. Julian, for all of this. I had so much fun. You at home listening, I hope you had as much fun as we did. And this is not the last time you'll be hearing from Dr. Julian on Wordfirst Radio. You'll be hearing from him soon. So we'll hope to see you again next week. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Wordfirst Radio. Be sure to like, subscribe, and check us out online at wordfirst.us.
Yeah!